They climbed aboard Graceful One, my boat, my pride, my sanctuary, like it was some floating event venue they had rented for the day. My deck, my cushions, the carefully varnished teak I'd spent months sanding and sealing by hand. Strangers, people I'd never seen before in my life, were dancing and laughing, spilling drinks, stomping around like they'd paid admission, like it was theirs. They popped corks like it was New Year's Eve, tossed confetti into the wind, and toasted to community, as if I didn't even exist. I stood on the dock, keys still in my hand, staring in disbelief. Not one of them looked my way. Not even the hosts, Roxanne and Heather, bothered to acknowledge me. They were too busy playing hostess, mingling with their guests like queens presiding over their court. At the center of it all was my boat, glowing with strung-up fairy lights and music echoing off the harbor. And nestled below deck, unnoticed by everyone else, were 3 bottles of 1960s wine, my father's wine, now uncorked, open, and being poured into red plastic cups. I know what I did after might sound drastic to some. Maybe even petty. But when someone disrespects your sanctuary, treats your property like a public park, something in you shifts. You start thinking differently. You start imagining what kind of lesson would actually stick. The truth is, I still wonder if I crossed a line. I still turn it over in my head at night. Was it too far? Or was it the only thing that would make them stop? You tell me. Have you ever had to teach someone a lesson they truly didn't see coming? Scroll down and leave me a comment. I'm genuinely curious. But before we get to that part, let me back up. Let me explain how this all started, and how it spiraled into something that still has the whole neighborhood whispering. My name's Dylan. I'm 38 years old. I've spent most of my adult life working construction jobs, roofing, drywall, framing, renovations, you name it. But boats? Boats have always been my passion. Not motorboats or jet skis or anything flashy. I mean real boats. Hand-built, wood-paneled, watercraft that feel like an extension of your soul when you're out on the water. When I was 25, I inherited a small plot of waterfront property from my grandfather. It wasn't much, just under a quarter acre with a cramped 1-bedroom bungalow on it, barely scraping 900 square feet. But it came with one thing that made it priceless, a private dock. Weathered, sturdy, jutting right into the bay like a handshake with the sea. That dock became my sanctuary. I spent the next 3 years building Graceful One from scratch in my backyard. Every weekend. Every vacation day. Every spare moment outside of work. I didn't buy plans online or order parts from catalogs. I drafted her myself, shaping her ribs and keel like a sculptor working with marble. The day we lowered her into the water, I swear I could feel her breathe. She's not huge, 28 feet from bow to stern, but she's beautiful. Teak deck, hand-stitched leather cushions in the cabin, custom brass fittings I polished with an old toothbrush. Every joint, every seam, every stroke of varnish carries a memory. It's not just a boat. It's a part of me. My escape. My legacy. The heart of Graceful One is the wine cabinet below deck. My father helped me install it. I remember his hands trembling slightly as he measured the spacing, his voice slow but steady. A boat without proper wine storage, he said, is just a floating shed. He brought over 3 bottles from his personal collection, wines from the 1960s he'd been saving for something special, and helped me secure them into the padded, shock-resistant case we built. Temperature-controlled, nestled between the ribs like a heart in a chest. These will be here when you need them most, he told me. And I believed him. I still do. That cabinet was his blessing on my boat, and every time I stepped aboard, I felt like he was right there with me. Life on the water was simple, peaceful. I'd get up before sunrise, make a strong cup of coffee, and sit on the deck with the harbor mist curling around me. The neighbors were mostly retired couples, quiet folks who respected space and silence. We waved, sometimes shared a story or a weather warning, but mostly kept to ourselves. It was the kind of life people dream about but never find. And I had it. Until the Morrison house sold. They moved in on a Tuesday morning in late spring, 2 women, maybe in their early 40s, clearly sisters. Even from a distance, something about them felt intense. I watched them unload boxes and pace the yard like generals inspecting a battlefield. They weren't admiring the view or settling in. They were assessing. Measuring. Planning. I told myself I was being paranoid. That maybe they were just overwhelmed. Moving is stressful, after all. I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Tried to imagine them as normal, even likable neighbors. I should have trusted my gut. That afternoon, as I checked the rigging on Graceful One, I heard the sharp click of heels on wood. I turned to see one of them, tall, perfectly put together in a white blouse and pencil skirt, striding down my dock like she owned it. "Hi there," she said, all bright teeth and polished charm. "I'm Roxanne, your new neighbor. And president of the neighborhood association." That was the first I'd heard of any association. She didn't skip a beat. "That's quite a boat," she said, nodding at Graceful One. "You know, keeping something this beautiful all to yourself seems a bit selfish, don't you think? We should talk about community sharing opportunities." At first, I thought she was joking. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. And something in her tone, slick, casual, predatory, made my stomach clench. I kept it civil. "This is private property. The dock and the boat are for personal use. Always have been. Nothing against community, but that's how it works around here." Her smile tightened. "This is Heather," she said, gesturing toward the shore where her sister stood awkwardly. "Vice president of the association. We're passionate about bringing the neighborhood together. Creating shared experiences that benefit everyone." Heather nodded like she'd practiced it a dozen times. I don't know what made my skin crawl more, their rehearsed enthusiasm or the way they looked at Graceful One, like it already belonged to them. Their vision of community sounded less like cooperation and more like appropriation. I refused again, firmer this time. Roxanne's expression changed. The mask dropped, just for a second. "You might want to reconsider," she said, her voice suddenly colder. "Around here, the boat isn't just yours. It's everyone's shared vision." I laughed, short and dry. "No, it's really not." But the damage was done. From that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple neighborly disagreement. These weren't the kind of people who asked for things. They were the kind who took them. And if you said no, they didn't hear it. They found a way to make you pay. I thought they'd back off. Thought they'd realize how ridiculous they sounded. But less than a week later, I came home from a supply run to find strangers aboard my boat, music blasting, red Solo cups overflowing, and Roxanne standing proudly on the deck like she was hosting a goddamn fundraiser. And that's where this story really begins. Maybe 2 hours, that's all I was gone. I'd headed into town to pick up some supplies for the minor repairs I'd been meaning to make on the dock, nothing serious, just routine upkeep. A few boards were starting to warp, and a couple bolts needed replacing. The kind of tasks that only someone who genuinely loves something would notice. Maintenance work might sound tedious to most people, but for me, it's therapeutic. There's a quiet satisfaction in it, in fixing, in tending, in preserving something you've poured your soul into. Just me, my tools, and the methodical rhythm of problem solving. I was actually looking forward to it. I'd even picked up some fresh fish from the market, thinking maybe I'd grill dinner on the deck and take Graceful One out for a sunset cruise later. That was the kind of evening I'd been craving all week, calm, quiet, mine. I should have known better. I should have recognized the universe never likes to leave things untouched when they're going well. Because as I turned off the main road and onto the long gravel lane that led to my house, I heard music. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe one of the neighbors was having a party. It was a Saturday afternoon, after all, and people are allowed to enjoy their weekends. I didn't mind noise, not really. I wasn't the type to complain about some laughter and a little bass floating through the air. I figured it was probably coming from the other side of the cove, maybe the Thompsons, they had grandkids visiting that week. But then I rounded the bend and saw something that made my stomach drop. The music wasn't coming from a nearby house. It was coming from my dock. Was, my boat. My heart kicked hard against my ribs, and I immediately slowed the truck to a crawl. No way. There had to be some other explanation. A mistake. An emergency. Maybe someone's boat had engine trouble and they pulled up for help. Maybe they were waiting for a tow. Maybe, I was grasping at straws now, but maybe someone had permission from a friend of mine. Someone I'd forgotten. A cousin of a neighbor or something. Anything but what it looked like. Because what it looked like was a party. A full-on, no apologies, red Solo cup kind of party, on my boat. I parked in a daze, barely noticing that the music had grown louder, sharper, like it was cutting into the fabric of my quiet harbor life. The thump of bass vibrated in my chest, matched by the pounding of my pulse. I could feel it in my teeth, like something feral trying to claw its way out of my bones. When I stepped around the side of the house and saw Graceful One, I stopped cold. 8 people. 8 strangers. On board. Dancing. Drinking. Laughing. One woman was sprawled across the stern cushion like it was a pool lounger. A guy was holding a cheap beer over my varnished rail, slushing it as he laughed at something someone said. Another man, shirtless and sunburnt, was filming the scene on his phone, narrating about community unity and the neighborhood's flagship getting some love. My flagship. My boat. There were plastic cups littering the deck. One had already tipped, leaking sticky liquid onto the teak. There were shoes, on my cushions. Someone had tied helium balloons to the railing, and a garland of tacky party flags stretched between the mast and the boom. There were food wrappers, open containers, and a half-eaten sandwich resting casually on top of the sealed hatch I'd just finished repainting the week before. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze, but my mind started to race. I couldn't quite process what I was seeing, like reality was bending under the weight of its own absurdity. It wasn't just the violation. It was the casualness of it. The comfort. These weren't people who thought they were trespassing. These were people who had been told they belonged here. And then I saw her. Roxanne. Center stage, drink in hand, gesturing animatedly near the bow. Playing hostess like this was her yacht and these were her guests. When she noticed me, she didn't flinch. Didn't look guilty. Didn't even pause. She smiled and raised her cup in a mock toast. You should be thanking me, she called over the music. You're the face of unity now, whether you like it or not. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. My jaw was clenched so tightly it felt like my molars would crack. My fists curled, and I didn't even notice I was digging my nails into my palms until I felt the sting. The rage hit me in waves. Not loud, not explosive, cold. Focused. Like ice in my veins. The kind that sharpens you instead of blinding you. Who the hell did she think she was? This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a miscommunication or an honest mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated invasion of my space, my peace, my home. And worse, she was treating it like some benevolent gesture. Like I should be grateful. Like she'd done me a favor. I wanted to storm the boat, throw every single person off, cut the music with a knife. But something stopped me. Not fear. Not confusion. Just disbelief. I stood there, watching, unsure if I was even awake. And maybe, deep down, I knew that if I reacted right then, it would get ugly fast. That I might do something I couldn't take back. So instead, I reached for my phone and tried calling my neighbors. First Jim. Straight to voicemail. Then the Hendersons. No answer. The Walkers? Out of town. The whole neighborhood had picked the worst possible time to be unavailable, and I was left standing alone on my own property, watching it get turned into a nightclub. The isolation made it worse. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was humiliation. Like I was being made a fool of in broad daylight. And Roxanne knew it. She was thriving in it. I tried to talk. To explain, calmly, that this was my private boat. That they needed to leave. But before I could get 5 words out, Roxanne cut me off with that same smile that made my skin crawl. We're just celebrating, she said. Bringing people together. That's what community is all about, right? I walked back up the dock and called the police. Not because I wanted to escalate things. Not because I thought it would fix everything. But because I had no other choice. These people weren't listening. They weren't even pretending to respect my property rights. Maybe, just maybe, a uniform and a badge would snap them out of whatever fantasy Roxanne had sold them. The dispatcher was professional, calm. Took down my address and said they'd send someone to handle the neighbor dispute. Neighbor dispute. Even the phrasing felt wrong. Like this was a disagreement between equals instead of blatant trespassing. But I was still hopeful. I had to believe that law enforcement would see it for what it was. When the officer arrived 20 minutes later, he was polite but clearly unimpressed. He listened to both sides, nodded thoughtfully, asked a few questions. Roxanne, ever the performer, laid it on thick, how she was trying to foster connection, how the neighborhood had been so isolated lately, how disappointed she was that I wasn't more open to communal use of shared assets. She made it sound like this wasn't my boat, it was a floating park bench. And the worst part? The officer seemed to buy it. Not entirely. Not enough to say she was in the right. But enough to suggest that maybe this could be worked out amicably between neighbors. That I should consider the spirit of the gesture. That I might be taking things a little too personally. I stood there, watching as the only person who could enforce the rules walked away without doing a damn thing. Roxanne's smugness inflated like a balloon. As the patrol car rolled down the road, she leaned in close, lowered her voice just enough to let the venom show. You'll learn to be more neighborly, she said. One way or another. And I knew. This wasn't going away. Not on its own. Not with polite requests or reasonable expectations or faith in systems that were clearly stacked against me. I was in a fight now. Not the kind you throw punches in, but the kind that digs into your sanity, your pride, your very sense of control. And I had no choice but to fight back. That was the turning point. That's when everything changed, not just in terms of strategy, but inside me, too. I stopped thinking like a homeowner under siege and started thinking like a man with nothing to lose. If official channels weren't going to protect me, if the very structures built to uphold property rights and personal boundaries were in fact enabling the people who were violating mine, then maybe it was time to stop playing by their rules. I wasn't about to sell my house. I wasn't going to leave the dock where my grandfather used to fish or the home where I'd built graceful one from the keel up. I'd spent over a decade crafting this life, plank by plank, memory by memory. I wasn't going to let a pair of entitled women in matching linen blouses and smug smiles bully me out of it. But I also couldn't keep going toe-to-toe with them in public forums or HOA meetings. That path led nowhere. It drained me emotionally and only fed their narrative that I was the problem, that I was some antisocial recluse standing in the way of their glorious, forced vision of community. So I pivoted. I began thinking differently, strategically. I wasn't out to hurt anyone. Let's make that clear. But if they were so determined to treat my boat like a free public venue, then maybe I'd let them. Just not the way they expected. Sometimes, the most powerful move you can make is the one that makes you look like you've surrendered. Let the enemy believe they've won. Let them celebrate. Get cocky. Make mistakes. So I changed my posture. I started acting defeated. The next time I passed Roxanne and Heather at the local bakery, I didn't acknowledge them. I pretended not to hear their thinly veiled barbs about neighborhood harmony or collaboration triumphs. I stopped spending time on the dock during the day, kept the lights off in my boat at night, and let a few visible spiderwebs build up near the gangplank, tiny things that signaled neglect. To an outsider, it would look like I'd emotionally checked out. That the conflict had worn me down. But I was working, just not the way they could see. In the early morning hours, when the neighborhood was still asleep, I began altering my boat in subtle, reversible ways. I scuffed the edge of the deck, carefully dulling the varnish I'd once polished with religious devotion. I removed a few pieces of rigging, leaving the sail equipment incomplete. These weren't actual damages, just visual cues of abandonment. I even left a ragged towel and empty tool bag hanging conspicuously from a hook, like I'd walked away from maintenance and never returned. It went against everything I stood for. It hurt like hell. But it was necessary. At the same time, I started quietly preparing Graceful One for something else. Something deliberate. I replaced the thick, industrial marine rope tethering her to the dock with a visually identical one I had sourced through a specialty shop. Same diameter, same texture, same nautical appearance. But this rope was different. It was engineered to snap under a specific amount of strain, safe for property, but unreliable under pressure. The first version I tested broke too easily, practically disintegrating in my hands. That one went straight to the trash, heart pounding in my chest as I realized how easy it would be to screw this up. I needed something believable, natural-looking failure, nothing that would raise suspicions. Eventually, I found what I was looking for. I studied local tides and wind directions. Observed how the current moved during different hours and moon phases. I plotted where a drifting boat might logically end up if it slipped its moorings. I wasn't planning an escape, I was crafting an experience. One they would remember. One they would talk about for a long, long time. I even marked the coastline in both directions, cataloging coves, inlets, breakwater zones, and how far the currents carried debris on slow days. I was planning something careful. Legal, technically. But with an outcome no one could ignore. The memory of my father's boat came back to me again and again during those nights. I was 15 when it happened. A sudden storm swept in off the Gulf, unexpected and mean. The mooring line snapped, and we found the boat a mile down the shore the next morning, gutted and half submerged. My dad didn't speak for hours. That boat had been his life's work, and watching it torn away like that broke something in him. That was the first time I ever saw what helplessness really looked like. I promised myself I would never feel that way again. But now I was facing a different storm. One made of smiling faces, empty words, HOA bylaws twisted into weapons. I didn't have wind and rain to contend with, just Roxanne and Heather and the slow erosion of everything I cared about. So I did the only thing I could. I baited the hook. A few days later, I made an offhand comment to Mrs. Peterson next door. She was watering her begonias, and I accidentally let it slip that I was thinking of selling Graceful One. Too much stress, I said, voice weary. The new neighbors have just worn me down. I even sighed for dramatic effect, letting my shoulders slump like I was carrying the world. Mrs. Peterson clucked sympathetically and promised to keep it quiet. I smiled and thanked her, knowing full well it would be the top gossip of the cul-de-sac by sundown. Within 48 hours, I'd heard it repeated, filtered through various neighbors, that I was giving up. That I was probably putting the house up soon. That maybe I'd finally seen the bigger picture. It made me sick to manipulate someone like Mrs. Peterson. She was kind. She offered me her garage for storage, just in case I needed space. But I couldn't let guilt derail me. Not now. Sure enough, Roxanne and Heather ramped up almost immediately. Their public personas changed, louder, bolder. They spoke more openly about neighborhood progress and reclaiming underused assets. They were acting like conquering heroes, already rewriting the story to cast themselves as visionaries and me as the bitter holdout who had finally been broken. I overheard them chatting on the sidewalk, practically giddy. Heather said they should hold a victory celebration. Roxanne called it a waterside unity gala. They wanted catering this time. A DJ. Twice the guests. Invitations sent to select residents from the neighboring development. They had no idea I was standing behind the hedge, listening. If I had any doubt about how far they were willing to go, it died in that moment. They were planning their biggest party yet. On my boat. And they thought I was going to let them. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, the kind of weather that looks like it was painted by a Hollywood production team. If I'd been planning a party myself, I couldn't have asked for better conditions. But this wasn't a party. It was a reckoning. I spent the morning going over everything. The rope was perfect. The wind direction matched what I'd planned. The tide schedule aligned with my drift map. My phone was fully charged. Every piece of the puzzle was in place. By 4 o'clock, the first cars started arriving. I watched from the kitchen window, blinds angled just enough to conceal me. They came in waves, neighbors I hadn't seen in years, new faces from the next development over. Then the catering van pulled up, white cursive reading coastal elegance across the side. That was the moment my stomach turned. They were turning Graceful One into a floating wedding venue. Roxanne stood on the dock in wedge heels and a flowing skirt, pointing, directing, placing centerpieces. Heather flitted between guests with clipboards and welcome drinks, her phone constantly snapping pictures. The whole scene looked like a magazine spread. By 5 o'clock, there were 15 people on board. Not counting staff. They lounged on my deck like it was a luxury yacht club. Laughed. Mingled. Someone brought lawn chairs. Someone else had set up a portable speaker again. But none of that compared to what happened next. Roxanne went below deck. When she re-emerged, she held a bottle of my father's wine in her hands. My father's 1967 Bordeaux. His favorite bottle. The one he'd handed me on my graduation day with a glint in his eye and a reverent voice. "This is for when you find someone worth toasting a forever with," he'd said. "The kind of moment you only get once." I'd kept it sealed for 17 years. Waiting. Saving it for something real. And now she was uncorking it like it was nothing. Like it belonged to her. She poured it into paper cups. Passed them around like lemonade. My vision went red. She climbed to the bow of Graceful One, held her stolen glass high, and called for attention. "This boat," she said, "represents what's possible when we stop thinking in terms of mine and yours, and start thinking in terms of ours." She gestured grandly to the crowd. "Let's raise a glass, to community. To progress. And to teaching selfish neighbors the importance of sharing." And that was it. The moment. The line that broke me. Because I wasn't just watching someone desecrate my boat. I was watching someone desecrate my father's memory. And she didn't even know it. Didn't care. And that's when I knew, it was time. Let me know when you want the follow-up scene. It's going to be unforgettable. There are moments in life when your anger feels so complete, so all-consuming, that it crystallizes into something sharp and clear. I stood on the deck of my own dock, gripping a glass of my late father's vintage red wine, watching strangers traipse across my boat like it was some kind of public entertainment venue. Laughter rang out, echoing across the water, hollow and grating. They were toasting with my father's wine, wine he'd carefully cellared for years, wine he'd wanted to share with family, not freeloaders, and celebrating a community event I hadn't approved, didn't support, and hadn't even been invited to. My boat, Graceful One, had been turned into a floating HOA-sponsored cocktail party without my knowledge or consent. And there she was, Roxanne, holding court like some deranged queen of suburbia, welcoming her guests aboard my property with outstretched arms and a pasted-on smile that reeked of smug entitlement. The sheer audacity of it all was staggering. I don't think I've ever felt such deep, vibrating rage. It wasn't the kind that made you yell. No, it was worse, it was the kind that made you go silent. Dangerous silent. I just stood there, watching from the shore, jaw clenched so tight it ached. I must have looked like a statue. Every muscle in my body locked in place except for my right hand, which trembled slightly as I raised the glass to my lips. I wasn't even tasting the wine. My father would have hated seeing it wasted like this, staining the deck under clumsy feet, sloshed into solo cups by people who had no respect for its age or story. I stood there long enough to question myself. Maybe I was overreacting? Maybe this wasn't the time to take a stand? But then I heard someone, some guy in khakis and boat shoes, joke about how they'd finally reclaimed the marina from that stubborn loner. Another person chimed in, laughing, talking about rezoning plans and open access to waterfronts, as if my private property were a public amenity. And that was it. That was the final shove over the edge. I turned, walked calmly to my workbench, picked up the shears I'd sharpened the night before, and headed back to the dock. I had planned for this. Not the exact timing, perhaps, but certainly the possibility. I'd spent nights thinking through the logistics, how the ropes could be modified just enough to look aged and frayed, like natural wear had finally won. The rope I cut gave way so smoothly it almost felt symbolic, like it had been waiting for this moment. No one on the boat noticed the quiet snap. They were too drunk, too distracted, too caught up in their stolen celebration. The wind and tide were perfect. I'd checked the forecast that morning and confirmed what I already knew, the sea would do the rest. Graceful One drifted slowly, elegantly, away from the dock. For a few blissful minutes, nothing changed. The music kept thumping, the laughter kept rising, and the party raged on, entirely unaware that their anchor to land had been severed. It was like watching a dream unravel in slow motion. A grotesque parade of wine and entitlement sailing gently into the unknown. I stood on the dock, arms folded, a silent witness to their oblivious departure. Part of me still couldn't believe it was actually happening. The boat had moved maybe 20, 30 yards offshore before anyone even noticed. Then I saw a younger man, one of those guys always filming everything for content, raise his phone to take a selfie. His brow furrowed as he noticed the shrinking shoreline behind him. He pointed, confused. "Hey," he called out, "why are we moving?" That was the spark that lit the fuse. The music cut off like someone had pulled the plug, and a wave of confused voices swept across the deck. People rushed to the railings, peering overboard. Some squinted toward the dock, trying to orient themselves. I could practically hear the shift, the subtle moment when confusion turned to fear. Then Roxanne's voice sliced through the chaos. Sharp, shrill, commanding. "Why are we moving?" she screeched, as if volume alone might arrest the tide. She looked utterly ridiculous up there, crown askew, heels wobbling, arms flailing like a dethroned monarch in exile. I waited a beat, letting the silence grow deliciously awkward. Then I stepped forward, out to the end of my dock, where I knew they could see me clearly. I raised my voice, steady and calm. "You wanted open access," I called out, letting the words linger in the air like a judge passing sentence. "Well, I hope you like open water." There was a beat of silence, long, stunned. Then the realization hit her. You could see it land on her face like a slap. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't bad luck. This was intentional. And she knew, right then, that she had no power here. Not anymore. I watched Graceful One recede, bobbing gently as it moved further into the bay. The party was well and truly over, though the consequences were just beginning. The wind was slow but steady, pushing them further out. I'd calculated everything. With the radio disabled, just a few key wires disconnected, and the phone reception spotty at best, it would take a while before anyone could even call for help. It wasn't permanent damage. I'm not a monster. The radio could be reconnected in under 2 minutes. But I wanted them to sit with that feeling, helplessness, vulnerability. I wanted them to taste what it felt like to have control ripped away. On land, Roxanne ruled through manipulation, social influence, and fear. But out on the open water, those tricks meant nothing. No HOA regulations. No board meetings. No city zoning commissions. Just salt water and silence. And fear. I could hear the voices rising now, accusations, panic, demands for explanations. People wanted to know who had authorized the event, who had confirmed the venue, why there weren't any life jackets in plain sight. One woman clutched her handbag like it might float. Another man was angrily tapping his phone, pacing as if cell reception would magically improve with movement. It was almost comedic, watching modern suburbanites stripped of their illusion of control. Then came the infighting. "You said the owner was totally fine with this," one woman shouted at Roxanne, her voice teetering on hysteria. "You promised this was all arranged." "I did." Roxanne snapped, but the desperation in her voice betrayed her. That's when Heather, her sister, co-conspirator, and until now, her greatest ally, turned on her. "You always do this, Rox," she yelled, eyes blazing. "Always assume your charm covers up your lies. I told you this was a terrible idea." Roxanne fired back, swearing Heather had been in on it from the start, insisting they were just trying to foster community engagement. But the cracks had widened into chasms. The unity they'd used to corner me was dissolving under the weight of real pressure. I remained behind a pile of equipment, just out of full view but close enough to hear the unraveling. I even hit record on my phone. I got audio of Roxanne yelling, "Just treat this boat like it has no owner, no one can stop us anyway." That sentence alone would be gold if she ever tried to spin this as a miscommunication. Along with footage of the wine-stained deck, the banners, and her self-important posturing, I had all the evidence I'd need. Still, a quiet voice in the back of my mind asked if I'd gone too far. Had I let my anger push me past the point of reason? But then I remembered how they laughed, how they dismissed me, how Roxanne had waved off my complaints like I was some inconvenient noise to be silenced. This wasn't just about a boat or a party. It was about respect. About the boundary between what's mine and what others think they're entitled to take. So no. I don't regret it. As Graceful One became a shrinking dot on the horizon, and the sun began to lower in the sky, I stood tall on my dock, glass still in hand, listening to the soft lapping of the waves. The chaos was behind me. What lay ahead? Probably legal letters. HOA meetings. Maybe even news stories. But in that moment, I felt peace. Because the sea doesn't care about HOA bylaws. The tide doesn't answer to board presidents. And out there, drifting under the wide, indifferent sky, Roxanne and her entourage were finally learning something I couldn't have taught them on land. That actions have consequences. And sometimes, those consequences come with currents. What had started as a smug little party on a stolen boat quickly unraveled into something far more chaotic, and far more satisfying, than I could have imagined. I had expected them to panic a little, maybe argue among themselves, perhaps even try to paddle back using wine bottles and desperation. But nothing prepared me for the unfolding drama that came once someone on board managed to get a signal through to the Coast Guard. I heard it all from my quiet little perch on the shoreline, tucked away in the shadow of a rock outcropping. The wind carried their raised voices across the water, frantic, breathless, and laced with that particular brand of privileged fear that comes only when people who are used to being in control suddenly aren't. From the snippets I could catch, the caller was doing their best to sound urgent, perhaps even life-threateningly so, describing how they were stranded on a boat that was drifting further and further away from land. There were requests, demands, borderline shrieking for immediate rescue. But the voice on the other end of the line, calm and clipped in that unmistakable government official tone, didn't seem to share the caller's sense of doom. The Coast Guard promised assistance, of course, they're professionals. But you could tell by the tone that this wasn't high on the priority list. Recreational boaters stuck in calm waters on a sunny afternoon? That didn't exactly rank up there with sinking vessels or open sea distress signals. They were going to help, sure. Just not in the panic-driven, red alert, helicopter dispatched kind of way Roxanne and her guests probably imagined. And so, the waiting began. It must have been excruciating for them, adrift, helpless, increasingly sunburned and surrounded by slowly melting cheese platters. But for me? It was better than anything on Netflix. I sat back, water bottle in hand, sunglasses on, and just watched. Roxanne was clearly trying to seize control of the situation, pacing the deck of Graceful One like a corporate executive managing a PR disaster. She kept pulling out her phone, trying to reach lawyers, city officials, anyone with power or influence who could somehow swing a magical rescue, or maybe even spin the narrative before it turned on her. But the cell service was unreliable, cutting out every few seconds. Most of the calls dropped before they could get beyond a panicked hello. She was learning, in real time, what it meant to be truly powerless. This was a woman who had thrown her weight around the neighborhood like she was the mayor of Willow Creek Estates. She wielded HOA bylaws like weapons, buried dissenters in passive-aggressive newsletters, and used charm and intimidation to get her way. 4 weeks, I'd endured her thinly veiled threats, her smug little smiles, her condescension wrapped in community spirit. And now, here she was, floating out on the ocean, watching her grip on control slip away with every gentle lapping wave. The irony was so rich I could taste it. I caught myself smiling, which might say something about the kind of person I am, but I won't apologize for it. After all the trouble she'd caused, it felt like justice. When the Coast Guard cutter finally appeared on the horizon, sleek, white, and humming with silent authority, I saw the mood on the boat shift instantly. They were saved, or so they thought. People began waving, shouting, some probably crying with relief. But they didn't realize that rescue was only the beginning. Because the Coast Guard doesn't just show up, throw a rope, and tow you back without asking a few questions. No, they investigate. They ask how you got there, who owns the vessel, whether it was legally operated, and whether any laws were broken in the process. And in this case, a lot of laws had been bent, if not outright shattered. Roxanne and her partygoers were about to find out that unauthorized use of a private vessel is not something maritime authorities overlook. From my quiet vantage point, I watched the Coast Guard board Graceful One. They spoke with everyone individually, took photos, documented the scene. Then they slowly started towing the boat back toward shore. I realized, with a sudden chill that cut through my satisfaction, that this might have been the perfect crime, or the perfect mistake. Had I gone too far? Was this poetic justice or criminal negligence? But it was too late to pull back now. The wheels were in motion. I had made my offering to the ocean, and the tide would decide what came next. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the water, Graceful One returned to my dock, this time escorted by flashing Coast Guard lights. The scene was surreal. It looked like something out of a courtroom drama, a stage-lit climax to a suburban soap opera. Across the street, I could just make out Mrs. Langley peering through her curtains, tea in hand, eyes gleaming with interest. She wasn't hiding. She was savoring every second, just like me. The Coast Guard officers remained professional throughout the process. They took statements, snapped photos, and issued citations for unauthorized operation of a watercraft. Watching Roxanne try to explain how she ended up throwing a floating cocktail party on someone else's boat was almost worth every ounce of aggravation she'd caused me. I kept my distance, letting the authorities handle it. But I lingered just close enough to hear her stumbling over her words, her voice cracking as she tried to downplay the situation. It was glorious. Of course, she didn't take it lying down. Within 48 hours, she'd filed a formal complaint, complete with dramatic accusations of attempted murder. That's right. According to Roxanne, I had deliberately marooned her and her guests at sea in an unhinged act of vengeance. She claimed I'd knowingly put their lives at risk over a minor property disagreement. The narrative she tried to spin was ludicrous. She painted herself as a victim of an unstable neighbor who had snapped over a boat, portraying her unauthorized joyride as a well-intentioned community event. What she didn't expect was that I had receipts. Lots of them. I handed over everything to the Coast Guard and local authorities, time-stamped photos of my no trespassing signs posted clearly at every entry point, audio recordings of Roxanne laughing as she told guests to treat the boat like it had no owner, and video footage from the first party showing their unauthorized entry. I even included copies of my previous complaints to the HOA, formal emails, ignored warnings, and their dismissive responses. The timeline was clean. I had tried to solve this the right way. I'd gone through the channels. I'd been mocked, ignored, and harassed. So when I finally took direct action, it wasn't out of nowhere, it was after being left with no other options. My lawyer, who had been quietly skeptical up to that point, actually grinned when he reviewed my files. He said it was one of the clearest-cut examples of justified self-help he'd ever seen. The association's lawyer, probably bracing for a long, expensive fight, took one look at the documentation and immediately advised Roxanne to drop the complaint. Not only did they withdraw the legal charges, but they also issued a formal apology for the misunderstanding. It was as close to an admission of defeat as I was ever going to get. But the fallout didn't stop there. The social consequences hit even harder than the legal ones. Footage from the original party began circulating online, especially after the rescue was mentioned in a local news brief. Neighbors started coming forward with their own stories, how Roxanne and her sidekick Heather had tried to take over the community garden without approval, how they demanded access to private pools, manipulated votes, and generally acted like they were royalty ruling over a suburban kingdom. By the end of the week, someone had posted a photo of Graceful One with the caption, "Karen's Cruise to Karma." It went viral in the local community groups before Roxanne even realized it was up. People she barely knew were tagging her, laughing, forwarding the memes. She deleted her HOA bio, and someone screenshot that too. The incident had become shorthand for what happens when entitlement meets accountability. Suddenly, Roxanne wasn't a respected neighborhood leader, she was a punchline. And with that shift came questions, real ones, about whether her continued presence on the HOA board was helping or hurting the community. Some neighbors even hinted at selling their homes if the situation didn't improve. Property values became the new buzzword. The pressure mounted. Behind the scenes, I heard murmurs of closed-door meetings and strategic discussions. Within a few weeks, Roxanne and Heather began stepping back from leadership roles. There was no big farewell, no public announcement. Just a quiet withdrawal, like stage actors slipping out a side door after flopping in a performance. The official story was that they were taking time to focus on personal matters, but everyone knew the truth. They'd overreached. They'd underestimated me. And they'd paid the price. And while victory was sweet, so sweet, it wasn't the headline that made me feel the most satisfied. It was knowing that they knew what had happened. That they understood how thoroughly they'd lost. And that somewhere, tucked away in a neighborhood newsletter or whispered over garden fences, people would be telling this story for years. And I wasn't even done yet. There was still one last detail that made this whole thing perfect, a secret I'd been holding back. But that was my ace in the hole. And trust me, it was worth the wait. Underscore 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 underscore. There's a detail I've been holding back, one last twist in the story that makes everything that happened not just satisfying, but downright poetic. It's the kind of ending that feels like it was scripted by the universe itself, like some invisible cosmic hand tied a big ironic bow on the whole chaotic mess. It almost sounds too good to be real. But I promise you, on my honor and on everything I love about the sea, this part is absolutely true. The truth, as they say, is often stranger than fiction. And sometimes, when the universe is in the mood, justice comes not only swiftly, but with showmanship worthy of a standing ovation. You see, what I haven't mentioned until now is where exactly the ocean's current took Roxanne, Heather, and their party guests during their unplanned, unauthorized voyage aboard Graceful One. When I ran the calculations, factoring in tidal drift, prevailing wind direction, and the specific current patterns for that particular Saturday afternoon, I didn't just predict that the boat would float safely away from shore. I knew, down to the nautical mile, exactly where it would end up. And let me tell you, the destination couldn't have been more perfect if I'd handpicked it myself. Where Graceful One drifted that day was not some quiet cove or deserted stretch of beach. No, the boat, along with its entitled, uninvited passengers, washed up right in the middle of the most extravagant marina in the entire region. Specifically, the luxury marina at the annual International Boat Show, held at the elite Bayshore Resort. We're talking about a place where yachts come with helicopter pads and champagne flows like water. An event so exclusive, the entrance fee alone could cover a month's rent in a decent apartment. This wasn't just any boat show, it was the boat show, drawing in the wealthiest maritime elite from up and down the East Coast. So instead of being lost at sea or rescued quietly by the Coast Guard, Roxanne and her crew were delivered like a half-baked entree straight into a crowd of the most refined, well-dressed, and extravagantly moneyed boat owners in 3 states. The juxtaposition was nothing short of divine comedy. The best part? The marina's rules were as strict as they were expensive. Emergency docking during the boat show carried a premium charge of $500 per person, plus $300 per hour for unauthorized boat storage. By the time they'd sorted out transport back to their side of the bay, they were facing a bill that dwarfed the Coast Guard citation they'd received earlier. All totaled, the financial fallout landed north of $3,200, and that doesn't include the lingering damage to their pride. But money wasn't the only thing they lost that day. The real blow came from the spectacle of it all. Because as fate would have it, there was a professional photographer hired to document the boat show, an artist with a keen eye for drama and contrast. And oh, what a scene he captured. His lens caught every chaotic detail of their grand arrival, Roxanne's wind-whipped hair, her makeup streaked down her face, her arms flailing in mid-gesture as she shouted at marina staff. Behind her, the guests looked equally distraught, sunburned, overdressed, and deeply, unmistakably out of place. Now, layer that image against the serene backdrop of $100 million yachts with names like Tax Shelter and Liquid Asset, surrounded by attendees in linen suits and designer sunglasses sipping chilled rosé. The contrast was so stark, so visually jarring, that the photo looked like satire. It was as if someone had photoshopped a rowdy bachelorette party into a Monet painting. That photo? It went viral. Local community forums lit up like wildfire. The memes started rolling in within hours. One showed Roxanne mid-screen with the caption, "Live, laugh, loot." Another featured the whole group with clown emojis over their faces and the hashtag Hijacked got served. My personal favorite read, "When you crash the party, but the party crashes you right back." The story spread through the boating community like a salt-laced breeze. Soon, Roxanne and Heather became cautionary tales, living, breathing reminders of what happens when arrogance sails headfirst into karma. People I didn't even know were messaging me links to the memes, tagging me in threads, sharing the photo like it was the town's new favorite painting. And yes, I saved that photo to my phone. For posterity. The fallout didn't stop with financial penalties and public shame. The resort, understandably mortified that its exclusive event had been disrupted by a group of trespassers, formally banned both sisters from attending any future maritime events on their property. Not just that boat show, but all events at affiliated marinas. It was a blacklisting of epic proportions. Let that sink in. The very women who tried to steal access to boats they didn't own were now officially barred from being anywhere near them in a luxury setting again. The irony? Chef's kiss. It was as if the universe had said, "You want boats so badly? Here, have a taste." But only a taste. And then never again. For the first time in years, I noticed something shift in my own neighborhood. People started greeting me again. Strangers at the marina gave me subtle nods of respect. I went from being the guy who just wanted his property left alone to a local legend. The story made its way up and down the coast, told and retold like a modern parable, the tale of the man who let karma do the sailing. Funny enough, I had once been invited to that very same boat show. A few years prior, the organizers had seen my woodworking and craftsmanship on Graceful One and asked if I'd be willing to participate in their custom builder showcase. I declined. The spotlight never appealed to me. I preferred my evenings quiet, my sails full, and my dock undisturbed. I'd built Graceful One not to show off, but as an extension of myself, an escape, a floating sanctuary. In the end, the boat made it to the show after all, just not the way I'd intended, and certainly not with the passengers I would have chosen. Life's funny that way. Sometimes the stories we write for ourselves get edited by fate in the most unexpected ways. 6 months later, Roxanne and Heather moved away. Maybe it was the social fallout. Maybe the costs were too much. Maybe the weight of becoming a community punchline finally became unbearable. Whatever the reason, they were gone, and with them went the noise, the entitlement, and the petty power games. My dock returned to its original, peaceful state, just the way I liked it. Shortly after, the neighborhood association held new elections. The incoming leadership was refreshingly grounded. The new president even reached out to apologize for how poorly my original complaint had been handled, and promised that future grievances would be taken seriously. They revised the HOA bylaws to clarify that personal property rights couldn't be voted away, in the name of neighborhood togetherness. A welcome gesture, but honestly, unnecessary. I think everyone had learned the lesson without needing it codified. Because here's the truth, some people only learn when they hit the bottom of the tide. Looking back, the whole experience taught me that being the villain in someone else's story doesn't mean you're not the hero in your own. You don't always have to fight back with force or fury. Sometimes, all it takes is a little patience, a bit of foresight, and a whole lot of trust in natural consequences. The ocean, after all, is a far better teacher than any lecture or lawsuit. Roxanne and Heather thought they could manipulate the rules, use social clout and administrative loopholes to take what didn't belong to them. But the sea doesn't care about your status. It doesn't care who your husband plays golf with or how many committees you sit on. It cares about wind, current, and tide. And sometimes, it carries people exactly where they need to go to learn the lessons they've worked so hard to avoid. The beauty of it all? I never once put them in real danger. I'd done my homework, calculated every variable, and ensured the drift path was safe. All I did was give them a gentle push, and let the forces they didn't respect deliver the message they wouldn't hear from me. These days, I spend my evenings on Graceful One, watching the sun melt into the water, my dock quiet and undisturbed. No screaming neighbors. No arguments. Just the sound of seagulls and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. It's the kind of peace you don't fully appreciate until you've had to earn it. That summer, the ocean taught all of us something. But I think I was the only one who was really listening. Sometimes you don't have to burn down the house to prove your point. You just let the tide carry the trash away. The end.